Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Stacy Connaughton, the director of the Purdue Policy Research Institute, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this Contemporary Matters discussion. These discussions, as many of you know, bring together experts and practitioners from across disciplines to discuss a common topic or contemporary matter from the lens of their field. And today we welcome our distinguished group of panelists to discuss social and gender equity in workforce development and manufacturing. I especially want to thank Purdue's Honors College for working with us to help make this event possible. If you would like to use the closed captioning feature, you can find that option at the bottom of the screen, and you'll just see a small rectangle with CC titled Live Transcript. So today we have with us, as I mentioned, a very distinguished panel. Let me introduce them to you now. Dr. William Spriggs is a professor in and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University. Dr. Spriggs serves as a chief economist to the AFL-CIO, where he chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He also serves on the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research. From 2009 to 2012, Dr. Spriggs served as Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy at the Department of Labor, having been appointed by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the US Senate. Dr. Spriggs has served in several roles in governmental and academic institutions, focusing on economic policies and issues of opportunity and equity. Dr. Spriggs, we welcome you to Purdue, even though it has to be virtually today. We hope that one day soon it will be in person. Next, we have Dr. Ernst Kosich, who's the Basil S. Turner Distinguished Professor at Purdue's Krannert School of Management. Dr. Kosich studies how work-life boundaries, work-life family, and diversity employment practices impact women's workplace inclusion and career equality. She's one of the leading researchers in the US on work and family policies, helps organizations and leaders implement work-life flexibility and work-life cultural change and gender equity initiatives. She recently led a commissioned report for the National Academies of Sciences on the effects COVID-19 has had on work-life boundaries and domestic labor of women in academic sciences, and has written reports on future work-life policies for the US Office of Personnel Management. She serves on advisory boards and research teams for centers on work and family, women in leadership, diversity, and workplace equality. Ellen, it's always so good to see you. Next, we have Dr. Rhonda Phillips, the Dean of Purdue's Honors College. Previously served as Associate Dean for Barrett, the Honors College at Arizona State University. Dean Phillips serves as a professor and director, where she served, I should say, we're happy she's at Purdue now, served as a professor and director of ASU's School of Community Resources and Development, and a senior sustainability scientist at the Global Institute of Sustainability. Dean Phillips is a 3-time Fulbright recipient, serving as a 2015 to 16 and 2012 Fulbright Specialist to Panama, and as the 2016 Fulbright UK Ulster Policy Fellow in Northern Ireland at the University of Ulster. Dean Phillips is committed to value-added learning experiences, combining educational, research, and engagement opportunities in experiential, transformative environments. She provides interdisciplinary teaching and research experience across a range of diverse topics, including sustainability, community well-being, economic development, and planning and world urbanism. Thanks again, Rhonda, for making this event possible and for being with us today. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Nathan Hartman is the Duck Family Professor of Advanced Manufacturing, head of the Department of Computer Graphics Technology at Purdue University, and director of the Purdue University Digital Enterprise Center. Dr. Hartman is co-executive director of the Indiana Next Generation Manufacturing Competitiveness Center, or what we've come to know as INMAC. Dr. Hartman's research focuses on the process and methodology for creating model-based definitions, examining the use of the model-based definition in the product lifecycle, developing the model-based enterprise, geometry automation, and data interoperability and reuse. He has been awarded over $10 million in research funding to support his work and has done that primarily with industrial and manufacturing corporations. Dr. Hartman leads a team in the development and delivery of online PLM and MBD professional education certificate programs for Purdue's various industry partners, and has worked very closely with the Ivy Tech Community College system around design technologies and digital manufacturing curricula to support Indiana's education and workforce development needs. Nate, always good to see you. So to start, each of our panelists will speak for a few minutes. While panelists are presenting, we ask that you please keep yourself muted. And then once all the panelists have presented, we'll open it up to everyone for questions and discussion. We want to keep this as close to a free-form conversation as we possibly can. And to help us with that, Dr. Ashima Krishna, the Associate Director of PPRI, will be moderating the chat and the discussion. So if at any point today you'd like to say something, please type it into the chat and she'll state each comment and question out loud for the panelists. If you want to further clarify your question, please go ahead and unmute yourself. Whenever you're not speaking, we just ask that you mute yourself again. Following today's discussion, PPRI will circulate a summary report, which we're delighted to do to hopefully keep the conversation moving forward. And now I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Dr. William Spriggs to begin our conversation. Dr. Spriggs, once again, welcome to Purdue.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you on this very important topic. Everyone today understands the reason this is an important topic. Our economy has been revealed to have very little resiliency. In the face of this global pandemic, all of us are dealing with price shocks and this product or that product. We aren't actually going through an inflation spike. We're really going through a series of random spikes as we have this product or that product that have very weak and not resilient supply chains. And so that part should be clear. And the other part that the current moment should make clear to us is the challenge for macroeconomic policy to return as close as we can to full employment. At the peak in 2000, and through most of the early part of this century, the employment to population ratio, the share of prime age workers who had jobs was a little over 82%. We are well below that level right now. We cannot return to that level unless we can get women's labor force participation to come back up. And women's labor force participation has collapsed in this century. So this is a very important topic to understand how can we get back. And for those of you who are a younger generation, remember that you would like to get Social Security. And if we don't have a prime age employment to population ratio of a little over 80%, it's very hard to figure out how you get Social Security to work because you have too few workers and too many people who are dependent on those workers. So this is a critical topic on all of those dimensions, our social security system, the sustainability of our economy. We need to be far more resilient. And the shock that the United States got this century from the introduction of China to the global trade market in the bulk of the US economic history, if you go back from 1945 to the end of the 20th century, we maintained the same number of manufacturing workers. We had business cycles, so we had ups and downs, but basically we had the same number. A lot of people have made a big deal over, quote unquote, the decline of manufacturing because they talk about the percentage of workers who are manufacturing. But of course, over that same period, manufacturing workers became immensely more productive. So it didn't take as many to keep production up. This century was a dramatic shock because for the first time, we actually lost manufacturing workers. And in the literal sense, of that. So we lost close to around 6 million manufacturing jobs, and we added 6 million restaurant jobs, which is part of the problem we have with our resiliency. And as we found out, that switch made our economy far less resilient. Our system was designed to keep stability based on workers' experience in manufacturing. That is, their access to unemployment insurance, the way that Social Security is structured, all of the things that we have that provide the stop gaps in case we have an economic downturn. All of those are designed around having manufacturing workers, not having restaurant workers, who normally do not qualify for unemployment insurance. So all of a sudden we had to, out of nowhere, invent an unemployment insurance for the 8 million workers in that sector who lost jobs because they wouldn't qualify for normal unemployment. So this is the challenge and the immediacy of it and why we need to care about it. Manufacturing itself has made some decisions that complicate it. In the past, we relied very heavily on amalgamation that like companies tended to clump together. And because of that, they were able to provide much mobility of their workforces. So think of early car manufacturing being centered in the eastern part of Michigan. And so it becomes quite easily to have interchangeability when it comes to workforces. Or in the case of Indiana, think of what happened when we lost Studebaker, that we were able to absorb the competition within that sector and shift those workers to other industries. Now that firms have located and isolated themselves and ripped apart a lot of that, it makes it harder because now it's harder to recruit workers when firms have decided to be the only employer in a very remote area. And add to that compounding problem that we have a decline in our unionization. The advantage in our aerospace industry is not only agglomeration, but because of the teaming with the machinist union, we have an agreement on what are the training standards across the industry. And we have a way for workers to move from company to company, adding to the dynamism of that industry. Having standards makes it easier for both the state and state training agencies to agree on what are we training workers to do, and transparency on how will they be rewarded if they get the training. And that's the other vital part of the equation. It's one thing for employers to say, this is a wonderful job and everything, but I got asked a question by a reporter in Indiana about a manufacturing company that claimed, well, we don't understand, why can't I find manufacturing workers? I'm paying $14 an hour. I should be able to get manufacturing workers. And I said, well, that's not a wage for a manufacturing worker. So, I mean, I'd like to buy a diamond for $20 too, but that's not the price. So, so the union partnership and having unions chip in, having everybody have skin in the game for training the workforce makes it easier because both workers and employers are on the same page about what are the skills, who's qualified, and what are they going to get paid for those skills. This is all important parts. To achieve equity really means intentionality. The only barrier to equity is intentionality. Do you intend to have a diverse workforce? That is the only barrier. If you don't intend to have a diverse workforce, you won't. If you do, you will. It's just that simple. I'm going to close here with just a reminder, particularly when it comes to equity and people thinking about technology and computers being vital to current manufacturing. If you will remember the movie Hidden Figures, you will remember in that movie that women could not be engineers. I think people miss that key part. The women who were the quote unquote computers were highly skilled mathematicians. They were given essentially the graduate assistant work of the engineers. You know, we've written these complex differential equations, but we're not going to actually solve them. Give that to the graduate assistants. Give this to the women and let them give us the answer. It's the women who wrote the computer programming, Black women in particular, but women in general. If you look at breaking the code of the Nazis, those were women who programmed those computers. Programming computers was deemed to be a woman's job because from an engineer's perspective, that's the work we don't want to do. So this notion that women can't code, blah, 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 Black people can't code, blah, 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 blah. It's like, time out. The people are still living who invented the coding. And let's remember when they wrote the code for getting people safely into space and back, that was on a computer with about as much power as what's in your cell phone. They could not write thousands of lines of code. They did not have gigabytes of memory or megabytes of memory to write that code. Current coders today, I will tell you, could not write that code. Because if I told them, you got 10 lines, you write the program, they couldn't do it. They don't know how to do that. So this notion that women or minority, the barrier is some innate something, this is part of a broader narrative to drive inequality and to find a justification that society is so susceptible to, and to believe that those who are marginalized can't do something. And the fact that the people are still living who broke the Nazi code, who got people into space, we all need to grow up. That kind of propaganda is not helpful. If you want to have a diverse workforce, that's because you want to, and there's no barrier to you having it. But if you're going to locate your factory in a remote area and limit workers who are going to be available, then you're going to have a hard time. And you're not going to be very resilient, as we have found out with meatpacking, because they're in remote areas. Too many other workers got sick, too many other workers died, and now they're asking, why can't we find meatpacking workers? Well, you killed them. So.
Dr. Spriggs, thank you so very much for your powerful insights, and what a wonderful transition as well to Ellen, who's going to talk more about her areas of expertise and beyond. Dr. Kosich, please take it from here.
Sure, and I do want to say that a couple of points segue from William Spriggs' talk. One is the idea of intentionality. If you really want a diverse workforce, employers know what they need to do to get workers in. It's not just wages, it's childcare, it's ability to have flexibility, to be able to train and have hours that match family life. And then this idea of portability through unions, whatever mechanism we have, and I do think the pendulum has shifted so much where workers have less power in this country, and the Great Resignation showed that people are tired of not being supported, and we need some way to have portability of training and jobs across industries, and people able to be lifelong learners with flexibility, because people are going to have one or two careers, and what you studied when you're in college won't necessarily be what you're going to do 20 years from now. And if someone takes time out for childbirth or cuts back in career, we need a way to motivate people back in. The other thing I really think is important from what he said, and many things, but one was the idea of the bankrupt social programs, that this is not a nice thing to do, whether you believe in justice, and we all do probably on this call, but we are economically going to have serious deficits in this country if we do not get more replacement workers working, because of the aging workforce as well. And so the US competitiveness is at stake. And we have not linked very well macroeconomists with individual psychological scholars trying to get women back in, we also need more initiatives that marry the macro and the micro perspectives on why people are not in the labor force. So I've studied flexibility in unionized workplaces. And one of the things I found was an Alfred P. Sloan funded study. And we published one paper on in Industrial Labor Relations Review, a colleague at my former institution, Peter Berg. And we found that when flexibility is supported by labor, that it actually improves workers' lives, but also they identify more with this representative. And I think employers would be smart to see how flexibility has been this perk that while many of us here on this call are able to be privileged in remote work for some of our job, or although I'm in the classroom tomorrow with a mask and a mic face to face, feel like a frontline worker, we need to have flexibility available throughout manufacturing jobs as well. And you say, well, how do we do this? Well, one thing I did find in our study is that unions are better at, in many manufacturing, fighting for leaves, time off. And so there is better paid sick and family leave. And that is something that needs to be widespread. There are many people in jobs that don't have paid sick leave, or if they have it, they don't have it for their family. And even paternity leave is not as widely available as it should be. And improving equality for women also involves improving men's participation in leave. And also many people have different family structures now where they're not living by family or grandma to help with care. They're a single person. They may have their own health issues. For flexibility, my research has shown that unions have it's not as easy to think about how do we redesign work processes. And there are companies like Cummins Engine and others in Indiana that have done some innovative things. One is the idea of having a generalist extra person on staff. Staffing levels are what are impacting the ability of the workforce to use flexibility, which affects your diversity of your workforce. So if you are understaffed, it's very hard to get time off. And yet if your child is home with COVID or school's down or just the daily rhythm of life, if you are going to have children, and fertility rates are dropping in this country, and that is a serious problem for our society. So what they do in some innovative manufacturing firms is just have a well-trained rotator person, just like in nursing. I've studied nursing homes where somebody can go into different roles, and when you're dealing with million-dollar machines, you need to keep retraining people and make sure that people are up to date. So staffing is one influence. I'd like to see companies really back up people more. I actually think that that's an area for policy to really think about safe staffing and backup staffing and having employers have a contingency plan. And I wrote an article for behavioral science or policy on inequality, work-life inequality of the pandemic. I also think another thing is the idea of no fault absenteeism. So in the winter, we know cars aren't going to start, that there are ice storms, for example. So some companies I know did have a call-in line where people would not be penalized and 90% of the time the workers aren't legitimate. So let's not redesign our policies for the smaller group of people that might abuse like time off, but we need to support people to want to come to work and stay in the workforce. And I know one company, a chip manufacturer in Texas, when COVID hit, they didn't want people coming to work with COVID. And so they changed their vesting because they realized that some of their workers were not vested in sick time and the people needed their paycheck. So they made it that if you were really sick from COVID, you would not be penalized if you stayed home. Those are simple fixes that we need to do. The other thing I think that is important is leader besides childcare, and I really think it needs to move from just a company perspective to a community perspective. So where William is talking about rural areas, Indiana, where we are, Purdue, is kind of rural. There is a shortage here, and I think it may not even be so much rural urban, but more these initiatives to get employers to cooperate to increase the supply of childcare in the area, to look at things like our school times are still ridiculous, ending at 3 p.m. You know, people are kind of on your own in America, regardless of whether we will pass a paid family leave. The question is how we will pay for it, who will be eligible in the paid sick leave. But we need to have incentives for cooperation to increase the supply of quality childcare in the area. And that also goes back to what Dr. Spriggs talked about, wages and making it more of a career for people. Last thing I wanted to close with, I was talking with a recent alum who's a senior vice president now at a company in Indianapolis, and she talked about how women don't see themselves as fitting in manufacturing environments. So she's starting, you know, and I agree with, she's starting a leadership development program. It also needs to attract women of color and all backgrounds. It's not just white women. You know, we're in Indiana. We're in a very, you know, Indianapolis is very diverse. And the same comment was made by another director of OD that I've talked to at a power plant in Nebraska. That's a major power plant company. And those jobs, you only need a high school degree for it to work in the power plant. And it used to be you had to lift so much to be a power plant employee. But now women can enter those jobs, but they're not getting enough female applicants. And it is one of a very well-paid job. So there is a gender disparity in when women are working, what they're being paid. So I'm going to pass it on to the next person and we'll continue the conversation.
Ellen, thank you so very much. And this is so beautiful. It's like you all plan these transitions because, Ellen, I think so much of what you and William have spoken about thus far relates to well-being, which I know is such a passion and a commitment of Rhonda, Dean Phillips, and just am delighted to pass the baton over to Dean Phillips for her to continue our conversation.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I have 4 points I'd like to make, and the first starts with well-being. And if you look at surveys of workers now, particularly since the pandemic, there are a couple of things that come up, particularly for women, as the top 3 things they're looking for. And that's things like a challenging, interesting assignments. It's an attractive pay and work-life balance. This is where well-being comes in. Really, it touches on all 3, but particularly work-life balance, like Ellen was talking about. This is where it seems like the biggest deterrent to getting more women to come into manufacturing jobs could lie, is that there's not the flexibility, there's not the perception of women as being able to do that kind of work. And then of course there's things that have been around for a long time, like sexual harassment and other things that we know of, the systemic sort of barriers to women entering this. Well-being is basically about overall, how well are we doing across economic, physical, environmental, social well-being. And we can't get there, like William was saying, Dr. Spriggs, we can't get there as a society unless we have everyone able to participate in these opportunities. One more thing about well-being. Black women, for example, in the US are paid 64 cents on the dollar for white males. That's an average. It's not manufacturing wages, that's an average. That right there alone is enough to say, we have to change what we're doing. There are structural problems here, there's policy problems. We've got to figure this out. We can't expect people to have and enjoy well-being if we can't even have similar pay for similar jobs. And the thing about manufacturing jobs is that, the second point I want to make is the opportunity. They pay higher. They pay much higher than other jobs. Women predominantly make up the retail sector. But if you look at manufacturing, we have less than 1/3 of women in manufacturing jobs. And of those, the highest proportion are in the lowest paid manufacturing jobs, which is apparel and textile. That's predominantly women, so they get the lower pay. So they don't even get the average pay of the manufacturing sector. And then plus we have less than 1/3 of women in those jobs. So we have, the second point is that perception needs to change and the opportunity. We need to make sure that we've got those wage premiums available for all women, women of color, any woman that wants to go into this area of manufacturing. And if you look at the highest paid manufacturing jobs, those are almost predominantly male dominated. So again, those perceptions and opportunities must change. The third point, and this goes back to what Dr. Kosich was saying, the loss of unions. Unions tend to fight for those kind of rights that impact social well-being, that impact things like job protection and work-life balance and flexibility. If we give that up, and we are rapidly losing those in the US, then we have lost the ability to make strides around social well-being. And you can look at the data, those members, women members, and people of color who are in unions tend to fare better than those who are not, but yet we're losing those. So that's the third point I wanted to make. And then the fourth point is a little bit, I guess has multi levels that I want to make here. But the big takeaway from this is that we are literally in Industry 4.0. We are changing rapidly. We know that things like artificial intelligence and other technological advances are changing rapidly what we do in the manufacturing sector and all sectors, but particularly the manufacturing sectors. It wasn't that long ago, I heard a colleague speak about a study in Indiana. We are heavily manufacturing dependent in our economy here in this state, yet we don't have the educational levels of those workers to be able to transition to the new economy, the new reality of a technology-driven economy with artificial intelligence and more into the digital age. So that made me think, okay, well, let's look then at educational attainment in the manufacturing sector. And while women with baccalaureate degrees has increased in the manufacturing sector since 2004 or so into current time, they've increased their job stability and ability to get those jobs. Women with only high school degrees or less has declined dramatically, as in by 20-something points deficit. So we know that we have to go hand in hand with this idea of changing industry into rapidly changing technology with having more educational opportunities. We can't get to where we need to be either in this state or in the US or the world for that matter without having those educational opportunities, particularly for women and people of color and others that may be don't have the advantage that others do, to get the degrees so they can compete, so they can enter manufacturing jobs, get the wage premium, and at the same time, that sector has to be able to address the things around work-life balance and flexibility so that we can increase well-being. All of those 4 points taken together are really painting a picture of what it means for sort of the manufacturing sector in the US, but particularly for women and people of color. And we know these issues exist. We've known it for a long time, but we have very little policy movement around it. And it's probably going to take industry themselves also recognizing that they have to step up to the plate to be able to do this, to have the kind of opportunities for women to participate. That's sort of it in a nutshell. What my bio didn't say is that I've worked in economic development since the mid-'80s, so I'm older than the hills at this point. But it's very interesting to see these transitions that are happening through the decades, especially with technology coming into play that is radically changing so much. And we've got to be able to respond or we will lose our position both in our states and our local communities, but globally as well. So it's critically important. Thank you.
Rhonda, Dean Phillips, thank you so very much for those insightful remarks as well. And Nate, Dr. Hartman, I know, I've heard many things in all three of our speakers, but in Dean Phillips's comments that relate to what you do on a day-to-day basis. I'm thinking particularly of the educational kinds of opportunities, partnerships with industry, et cetera, that you're so heavily involved in. So I'm delighted to turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Stacy. And thanks to William and to Ellen and to Rhonda also. As I was sitting here listening, I was thinking about how I might actually open up and talk about this, but I appreciate Rhonda's segue about Industry 4.0, and in the sense that a lot of what I do, as Stacy said, on a day-to-day basis is dealing with that particular phenomenon, both from a technological perspective, the proverbial nuts and bolts, if you will, even though they're often digital today and not necessarily physical, but also what that means for our workforce. When Stacy introduced me, she talked about something called INMAC, and I guess maybe that's where I'll start for just a little bit, the Indiana Manufacturing Competitiveness Center. And there's, so in addition to working with various kinds of technologies that affect our manufacturing workforce, we also engage a lot with our K through 12 system here in Indiana, which is often, and in particular, the elementary school level, which is often a left out or neglected level of our educational system as it relates to manufacturing. Yet a lot of research has shown that children as young as 5 or 6 years old will form perceptions and ideas about what it is they want to do, what they want to do when they grow up, right? And in many cases, they understand police officers, firefighters, teachers, doctors, and nurses, because in many cases, children at that particular age level, those are the kinds of folks they encounter in many cases. Yet most of us, I suspect, probably didn't encounter people in the manufacturing sector when we were that particular age. And so some of the work that we do in INMAC is trying to bring these technologies and bring these kinds of people in front of the K through 5 part of our school age population to begin to help them understand. For example, we have, I think it's 28 or 29 now, we call them design and innovation studios in elementary schools and a couple of middle schools and a handful of them in companies across Indiana who partner with schools in their area. And the intent was to basically continue to reinforce math and science standards for education, but in the context of designing and making. And so we outfit these laboratories with things like small robotic arms, small programmable robots, small 3D printers, small CNC tools, computers with 3D design and modeling software on them. We hired teachers to help us write the curriculum according to Indiana's standards. We employ some of our pre-service education students here at Purdue as interns to help teachers in those laboratories across Indiana. We've partnered with companies to kit the various items that they need for these laboratories, as well as the curriculum, and offer it to teachers so that hopefully the only thing a teacher needs to do to introduce these to their students is to teach what they would normally teach anyway. And we offer summer as well as on break kind of continuing education for teachers so they can keep up with their certifications and licensure options and so on. But the reason I bring this up is because for every industrial revolution we've had, most of us learned about the Industrial Revolution, not a industrial revolution, but particularly those of us of certain ages. But the intention obviously is that we wouldn't call it Industry 4.0 if there wasn't a 3, a 2, and a 1. So my point is that for every industrial revolution we've had as a country, there's been an equal and accompanying educational revolution. And so arguably we are on education 4.0 as well. We may not call it that, or we may not have folks realize that, but we are there. And, William mentioned in his presentation that COVID has shown us certain things about the lack of resiliency in our economy, in things like our supply chains and so on. And Ellen mentioned, what this has done to our workforce demographics and our ability to adjust or inability in certain cases to adjust in certain areas. And this is something that I think is also incredibly important. And without getting too deep into some of the technologies that are at play here, one of the other interesting phenomena, I think, is when you look at agriculture years ago, it used to take a lot of people to raise crops, to raise livestock, to ultimately bring food products to market and so on and so forth. But then we began to mechanize things and then to automate things. And then that reduced the number of people, arguably, that we needed in agriculture, yet to produce the same amount of food or even more food in certain cases. And we're seeing some of that within the manufacturing sector as well. I think even to the point, obviously, where people are worried that that automation or that technology in general, from sort of a deterministic point of view, may take away too many jobs, or maybe take away all jobs. Yet, I guess personally, I'm not necessarily a believer in that, but it certainly will require different kinds of jobs and different kinds of training and different kind of education. And so, maybe I'll summarize, Stacy, with a little bit in saying this. We are at a point where historically it's taken a certain amount of capital and a certain amount of expenditure and a certain amount of infrastructure and so on to be able to manufacture something, because large factories got built and we had to have hundreds or even thousands of people in a specific spot to make something. And that's not even accounting for the supply chains and other, next level out kinds of production or service activities that support that manufacturing. Yet we're at a time right now where, depending upon the kind of product I might want to make or the kind of offering I might want to give to someone, if you think about this, I can get open source technology that allows me to create digital models of an object. Maybe it's my water bottle here, right? I can essentially buy the parts to make a 3D printer, or to even make a small desktop machining capability for less than $500. Now, $500 is still a good bit of money, but my point is it's not $5 million and it's not $50 million to build a new factory. It's not even $5,000. And so, again, depending upon what it is that I'm trying to make or the kinds of market I'm trying to reach, the barrier for entry into designing and making something, which at its most fundamental level is the basis of manufacturing, designing and making something. That barrier of entry today is pretty low. So how do we train people? How do we educate people to take advantage of those kinds of technologies, the accessibility of them, and so on? Now, I don't mean to oversimplify the social or the economic phenomena that my three colleagues have described. Those certainly need to be worked out and addressed. But in parallel to that, technology continues to develop. Technology continues to move forward in ways that don't necessarily have the same parameters around them as we historically would have had. And so, Stacy, with that, I'll go ahead and stop and pass it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to all the panelists. That was a great discussion. I will take over from Dr. Connaughton to moderate the discussion. And for all our participants, you are most welcome to post any questions that you may have for our panelists. I think we got some really thought-provoking perspectives in this discussion so far. And so please do take this opportunity to ask any questions that you may have of our panelists. Please post them in the chat and I would be happy to go over them as they come along. So I will take this opportunity to start with sort of a broad question for all of the panelists, and it would be great if sort of each of you could reflect on that a little bit. So what can universities and policy think tanks do to help address the kinds of equity, well-being, and economic and other kinds of challenges in workforce and manufacturing that we have discussed so far? So for example, and of course, each of those connect with all of your specialities and training as well. And so I would be curious to see if you had some suggestions or perspectives on how a university community like this and others around the country could work on helping address some of these challenges. So I'll start with Dr. Spriggs, if I may.
Well, I think it's not just make sure that we're not siloing ourselves. There's a tendency to have this driven from the technology perspective, and then we've had this discussion as if I don't mean this specific discussion, I mean the national discussion, as if technology is destiny, and that's not true.
Mhm.
We increased productivity at a faster rate from 1945 to 1970 than we have since. That was our most dramatic increase in productivity. That's when we really steeped up the investment in introducing robots and making almost everything mechanized. And so we had a very dramatic increase. And during that period, we had a brief time in which we increased manufacturing workers, but since that time, it was all increases in productivity. So part of it is just being careful in our language. There's a difference between you only need 180 million manufacturing workers versus, or whatever number. There's a big difference between that and people confounding it by talking about the percentage. You know, Dr. Hartman pointed this out, right? We have roughly the same number of farmers as we did in colonial America, but they're much more productive. This is compounding of their productivity means we don't need the same share of people. We need the same number of people. We don't need the same share of people. And the same is true of manufacturing. We have to be careful ourselves in the academy that we don't reinforce perceptions of inequality. We need historians to be part of the conversation, to remind people about the very dramatic changes that have already taken place. Entire occupations that have been wiped out. In the 1990s, we wiped out secretaries. Word processing took that job away. And in the 1950s, we got rid of Pullman porters on trains because we don't travel by train anymore. We got rid of manual operators of elevators. We went to automatic elevators. This is not new. There's too much of people in technology acting as if this is a revolution we have not lived through. The very earliest use of computing done by women was to replace people doing typing and pen and paper for billing. We got rid of billing departments back in the 50s and 60s because it got done by computers. We got rid of telephone operators because you now dial directly. You don't need the intervention of a human being. We did that a long time ago. So this needs to be, the university needs to have a broader conversation so we get a little humility about how technological process takes place. This is not anything revolutionary. It's not even close. It's not even remotely close to what we've undergone before, with the exception, as Dr. Hartman pointed out, when we went from the 19th to the 20th century, when we went to an actual modern world, we did understand no one knew electronics. No one could know how to run a motion picture projector. No one could know how to operate a radio. These things not only did not exist, their predecessors didn't exist. So it wasn't like, oh, well, you're programming computers for X, now you're programming computers to do Y. That's what we're talking about now. We're not talking about, there is no such thing as a computer, there's no such thing as electricity, and I don't even know what you're talking about when you say computers. And we forced America to understand, you're not going to have an 8th grade education and then have this modern society. We are losing the battle when it comes to getting politicians to say, you're not going to do the 21st century with notions of 20th century education levels. That it wasn't possible to go from the 19th century to the 20th century using 19th century education. Is not possible in 21st century with 20th century education. That's not possible. And we need to do a better job of convincing policymakers they have to go back to investing in public higher education.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Spriggs. And I think Dr. Hartman has a response to that. Dr. Hartman?
Yeah, I absolutely, and I'd like to piggyback on what William said, and maybe offer an additional because I agree with everything you said. I think it's important to think about, assume for a moment that we are in this thing called Industry 4.0, which meant we started with 1.0 and went to 2, and then went to 3 and went to 4. I think it's important to also realize a couple things. When we were in Industry 1.0, right, the mechanization of things, we were mechanizing, in many cases, human labor, right? We were trying to make it easier to do work. And then we went to electrification of things, and then we went to automation of things, and now we are in digitalization of things. And there was a jump that happened in between 3 and 4, which is 1 and 2 and 3 were sort of, 2 was a refinement of 1, 3 was a refinement of 2, but yet we were still talking about essentially the efficiencies around trying to remove human physical labor.
Mhm.
Now there's a bit of a change happening with AI and machine learning and some of these other digital technologies. Now we're talking about automating human cognition. We're talking about automating human decision making. And again, while I'm not necessarily a proponent of lights out factories and removing humans completely from the loop, my point is this, though, is that we are likely going to change the way people begin to work now, because the human being is not the sort of the sole cognitive agent in the production environment anymore. And whereas historically they still were, even though we automated labor or made labor more efficient, there were still certain things that humans could do better than machines. Right now, I still believe there are certain things humans can do better than machines, but machines are eating into that a little bit. Okay. The other thing I think that's also important to note is look at the time that passed between Industry 1.0 and 2.0, and then from 2 to 3, and now from 3 to 4. And I'm assuming, because there's an Industry 4.0 right now, that eventually there's going to be an Industry 5.0, and that time will continue to shrink. And so if you look at just across the timeline of history, the time between them has shrunk. Before, society writ large could absorb that change in the workforce in many cases. But as these time periods continue to shrink between the peaks of each industrial revolution, we may not be able to absorb as much that change in the way people work. And so some of the other social and economic phenomena that my colleagues have mentioned will likely just become that much more exacerbated because of certain things that technology is either enabling or disabling, depending on what it is that you're talking about. So just a couple of things to think about there.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Hartman. Dr. Kosich, you had your hand up to respond.
Yeah, and it's I think these are all great points, and I think one of the original parts of the question was also on well-being. How do you promote well-being? And I think there's some exciting initiatives happening where well-being is being placed front and center with other human capital strategies. So years ago, I worked for GTE, which was now Verizon, and I was the only HR person with a lot of engineers planning the HR strategies as they were switching fiber optics technology. And we need to do the same kind of strategies for resilience and burnout and retention. And so NIH has Total Healthy Workplace conferences. There's one coming up in October, and there's centers that are funded around the country. I don't know if that's something Purdue would ever want to do or partner with, like a Howard or whatever, but I do think there is a science to this, and I think it has to be front and center with marketing, finance, changing technology. The other aspect is just culture change and OD. And we really, from diversity, inclusion to well-being, companies, I think I'm planning a diversity conference, and I've invited a number of companies, and some of them have said, we are doing things externally, but we don't want to go too public unless our internal house is in order. And so social responsibility and well-being is both an internal approach to systemic change. We can do things in our own house, and we do need to do things in the community. So working with the National Institute of Health, I, for about 10 years, have been working on validating leader supportive online training, and it teaches leaders 4 behaviors to be more work-life supportive. And it's not rocket science. It's kind of like kindergarten, right? Teaching people to be nice to your workers. But we find in randomized trials that just training leaders and reminding them of some behaviors to do, just like filling out your accounting form, it reduces depressive symptoms, intention to turnover, let's see, reports of physical health, fighting with other people. I mean, you can't be productive when you have these problems. And so I do think companies need to invest in leadership development. And that's another place for universities not to be siloed, as William said, to partner. Now, I will tell you, I've been trying to find I have some partners to study support for family and sick leave, because I have one grant that I'm working on now. During the Great Resignation and COVID, it is a hard sell to train companies to support workers' time off when they're sick and their family needs it. So if anybody knows, I've got a few companies, but with COVID, I would like to get a few more, because this is not something U.S. Industry thinks about as a mainstream part of our culture. It's kind of like you're on your own. How do I help you with time off? And how does that help my company? I don't see the connection.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in really quickly, and I agree with everything my colleagues have said, and it's so true that we need all of the above. But here's an idea that I just want to, excuse me, allergies with all the snow and stuff, cold weather. I just want to throw this out there as sort of food for thought, no pun intended. But if we look at supply chain and how difficult that's been for getting what we need during the pandemic, but it also brings up an opportunity. Just like we've looked at local food systems, which only maybe less than 10% of most communities would have, or bigger communities would have local food productions. But what that does is give local workers, local, maybe small business owners, small landowners, the opportunity to create things for a local market. So it helps offset the breakdowns in the supply chain. Instead of waiting for food to come from 1,800 miles away, you've got some basics right there. There's some communities that are pushing that pretty hard to have at least 10% of their food source have from their local or regional food system. The same analogy in some ways could apply to manufacturing or creation of goods and products for consumption. It would never substitute for the large scale cost advantages of producing the vast majority of our goods overseas in lower cost places. But what it could possibly do is for specialty products or for things that we could produce in local or regional economies, it could provide some jobs for those people that are displaced by rapid technology change and lack of education, and be incorporated into training programs that, and there are a couple examples of these. There's one in Detroit, there's one in Cleveland. Vermont has a Vermont Work for Women program that does something similar. And why couldn't it be done like that? And then maybe training for specialized skills, things that we can't get easily, readily in the workforce. Maybe it's training those that don't yet have higher education, but need that as part of their growth trajectory, but creating some jobs for people in local and regional economies. And again, I fully recognize it will never replace a global economy in the manufacturing scale where cost is the driving force for just about everything's done. But there could be some opportunities, just like we've done with local food systems and food products and services. We can do a similar thing with manufacturing. It's almost like we need that to happen to be able to stay competitive so that we don't leave behind, say, rural areas or smaller communities that are not going to be able to be as automated as quickly or have those kinds of capital investments. And like Nate was saying, sometimes the technologies may not be that expensive to do some of these things. So why not think about this as a sort of community well-being opportunity to improve jobs and income and flexibility for people that live in communities and regions that might be disproportionately affected or impacted by these rapid changes in our economy, and help bolster local supply chain, just like we saw, for example, with masks. Well, other countries are making masks, we couldn't get them until people started making them here. There's other opportunities too to do similar things and to supply things locally and regionally. Anyway, that's just a thought I wanted to throw out because it touches on several of the questions that are in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. Dr. Hartman?
Yeah, thanks, Ashima. It's interesting. What Rhonda said just a minute ago takes me back to March of 2020. There was a group of about 40 of us here at Purdue that turned our manufacturing research labs, kind of like the one you see behind me, into PPE production facilities. We made about almost 90,000 pieces of PPE for Purdue and for surrounding healthcare communities and so on. Well, why? Because they couldn't really get it anywhere else. And if we were going to keep Purdue open, we needed to be able to do that. And so, we were buying out Home Depot and Menards with all their Tyvek wrapping, and we were working with the folks over in humanities and social sciences to design flat patterns to sew isolation gowns out of construction materials. We were making face shields. We even cut a mold to make reusable N95 masks, right? Why? Well, because Purdue had shut down research operations, but we still had capability and capacity to be able to do those things. So I think capability and capacity are not always equally distributed. And I think to some degree, I've talked to a lot of manufacturers around Indiana, and they sort of lament we have a jobs problem. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not sure we have a jobs problem. I think we have sort of a expertise and capacity distribution problem. And because, manufacturing historically has been place bound, right? Because you would set up a factory and you invest a whole bunch of money and effort into setting up a factory, and communities develop around that. And so I think historically, manufacturing has been sort of a community development activity, for lack of a better word. And again, I'm not an expert in that, and I know some of you are, but generally you look at these ecosystems that crop up, yet the challenge we have when something like COVID comes along is that it's this community-based activity, and it's hard to deal with a supply chain, and Rhonda, you mentioned something that made me think of this, is that this idea of localized ecosystems is that, Uber doesn't work because, and Uber's not popular because somebody invented a car 5 years ago. Why is Uber what it is? Well, because you can connect capability or you can connect need to capacity, right? And so we're seeing that now with the advent of cloud computing and analytics, and just increasing digital connectivity, that manufacturers now are advertising when they have capacity, almost like a timeshare, or almost like the way we used to do mainframe-based computing, right? You pay for certain amounts of time. And so, the metaphor of a supply chain, right? It implies a serial set of value-added activities. It implies also that your chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? So one of the things we're starting to see is this term called a configurable supply network. And the idea being that it's not just one value-added activity that each location does. It's this ability to do multiple kinds of activities, and using the power of digitalization and information, we can begin to aggregate capacity, or we can get an aggregate view, I should say, of capacity. Now, again, this is still in its niche and nascent kinds of stages, but if the technology continues to develop in a way along the same lines, we very well could have sort of an Uber, if you will, for manufacturing capacity that might give us, to William's very early point, a certain amount of resilience in our sort of supply capability across an entire sector that we may not have today.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hartman. Any other perspectives or comments from the panelists? Okay, great. So we do have some great questions that have come up in the chat box. One question that is from my students, so I'm excited to share that. So Corinne asks, do you think that similar to the need for childcare and extended sick vacation leave, a higher minimum wage is a necessary part of getting people, and particularly women, back into the workforce? Thank you for that question, Corinne. And I would imagine that this would apply to actually all of our panelists, but perhaps if Dr. Spriggs and then Dr. Kosich could take the questions.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Kosich did a great job of reminding everyone of the importance of childcare, the care economy broadly speaking, and getting women's labor force participation back to what we had in 2000. The result of the dramatic and continued rise in inequality that we experienced in this century is that the price of childcare, the price of anything follows demand. And if you have inequality, you can skew what the demand is. And so the result is, because childcare is in the marketplace has always been dominated by higher income women hiring lower income women, the price point for childcare has risen faster than the median income, so that most women can no longer afford childcare. It has become a continued challenge for a continuing share of women, and the market is now making it an inefficient way to provide that infrastructure. The result is the United States, which once was the leader in the world in the 90s in women's labor force participation, we are now among the 7 largest economies, the G7. We're number 6 in terms of women's labor force participation. And for the issues that Dr. Kosich raised about us being the only industrialized country that does not have maternity leave, we do not actively continue the relationship, the employment relationship of women, as is true for every other industrialized advanced economy. The result is that women in the United States have a bigger pay gap between men and women than all other 20 largest economies, the G20, except for Turkey and India. These are the only 2 countries that are worse than the United States. And so if you want to get back to where you were, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is a think tank for nations, and they compare policies so that nations can understand which policies work and which ones don't. Beyond the doubt, the reason Japan and Germany surpassed the United States is they put in place childcare infrastructure. They always had maternity leave, and they always had paid sick days. They just took advantage of that. They've created the infrastructure so that they surpassed the United States. Asking the United States to get back to the women's labor force participation we had in 2000 without those things, you may as well say, you know, I want to go to the moon, but I don't want to build a rocket. I mean, fine, good luck. It's the only way to get there. And if a company locates, you know, Dean Phillips did this, I'm sure, when a company comes to locate, they will ask for road changes, interchanges with highways. They will ask for access. That's considered infrastructure. Infrastructure simply means, what are the public investments necessary to remove the frictions to get people to work? The care industry is a necessary infrastructure. It is as necessary as a road or high-speed internet. You cannot get people to work without that infrastructure. It is such a shame that we divided the legislation, and we have everybody now saying that childcare is social spending. In the 21st century, it is not social spending. It is the necessary infrastructure of modern advanced economies. And if we don't want to join the club, then you're going to lose every game and continue to act like you can do it without it. Like I said, I'm sorry, it's just stupid because it's not possible.
Wow. I would love those to learn more about the rankings of the US and those sites. Because I think the US still thinks we're number one. And that's what's so sad. Like, we were number one, as you said, like 2 or 3 decades ago. Just on the pay issue, I think workers across the board, for like that $14 an hour job in Indiana, it's really the gains to the owners and the senior management. It's not trickled down to the workers in terms of pay increases. Back on pay gaps for women, I'm writing a review on flexibility, and I'm looking at all forms of flexibility together. And it's well known that women are heavier users of flexibility, and there are economists at Harvard that have written on this. I think it's Claudia Golden might be one of them. And it basically, so it's not enough just to offer it, but then once you have it, if the women are the heavier users, it perpetuates the institutionalized barriers. We already have wage gaps, as was cited, between men and women in the I think Rhonda said, in the types of industries that they're more well represented in. So we have to then get equal take up. And even I teach global HR too, and countries like Sweden that we romanticize as having the best in the world, they do. They're better than we are, far better. But take up even there, and I was invited to be keynote in Sweden at an early work family conference, is still less for men than women, and men take it shorter time. So you need these strategic initiatives to try and get gender equality. We do not have, I believe, that's quite what I would like to see, the Minister of Gender Equality. I was also in Korea, and I got to meet with a minister there on gender equality. And we're going to be like Japan, with more old people buying diapers than for babies if we don't figure this out. So I know, I guess the bottom line is, we really, now when we're so politically divided, I fear for our country. And I think I've been teaching diversity right now and sort of perspective taking. And I wish we could, even for 1 or 2 of these policy points, like they used to do, I forget, on one of the old channels about the right and the left talking, but we need to have 2 groups that say we need leaves, or we need to support working families, we're not sure how, and try to do piecemeal, at least some movement on these policies, because I fear that we're not linking our ideas to what's happening in Washington and the state level. 50 different ways of solving it also makes me very concerned. So I don't know, maybe you need to have politicians on for your next panel on how to move forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kosich. Okay, so I have another great question coming up for all 4 panelists. This is from Naomi. She says, from the manufacturing worker perspective, how much have you heard about hesitancy and/or resistance to unionizing, and what work is being done to negotiate with potential hesitancy? While I agree that there are great advantages to unionizing, I recognize the resistance I have heard from community members I've worked with in hospitality and medical industries. So perhaps for this one, we could start with Dr. Spriggs and then go to Dr. Hartman and then Dr. Phillips, perhaps.
Well, unions are at their height of popularity in the US, and the COVID crisis has taught workers how little they're respected by their employers, and that's heightened this sense that they need a voice in important policies. The difficulty is that the United States has not modernized its labor laws since the 1940s. Canada started off with the same set of labor laws that we did. After all, we're talking about the same companies, and many of the unions are the same unions. The United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers represent workers in Canada and the United States with the same companies. But over time, Canada modernized its labor law. They prevented permanent replacement of strikers. They introduced mandatory arbitration for the first contract. They actually have fines if you violate their labor law. We do not have fines for violating our labor law. And so you see the difference. They've been able to maintain their union density at a much higher level than in the United States. And so it's ironic that the rights of American workers are not kept pace with the way in which companies are allowed to get around the original intent of the law. And it's a shame. So we and the labor movement have been working very hard with what is called Protect the Right to Organize, or the PRO Act. We now call it the Richard Trumka PRO Act. And it has passed the House in 2 different Congresses under the leadership of Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia. But it is stalled in the Senate, and this is unfortunate because unions make a difference not just for unionized workers, but for non-union workers, because they set what is the pay scale, broadly speaking, in industry, even for those they don't represent. And they ensure democracy because they ensure that at higher levels of union density, the politics of the state changes. So as an example, in this moment when we're having democratic crises, the states that are passing regressive laws to limit voting are not high union density states. And high union density states, that's not the legislation, because people want to vote. Normal people want to protect democracy. This can only be achieved when you quell the voice of workers. It's the reason why Hitler got rid of the unions as soon as he could. No dictator wants to have unions. And so we have to remember this broader environment that unions create. In states with high union density, there's more expenditure per pupil in K-12 education, because that's important to your average worker. Medicaid got expanded in those states with higher union density because health is important to your average person. So it's not just taking away the voice of workers at work, it's taking away the voice of workers in the democracy. And that has to be important to all of us. And I mean, it goes across the board. I mean, higher incarceration rates in states with low union density. I mean, the idea of freedom is something that people like, but they have to have their voice in the political system in order to let it be known. What do normal people want? We want freedom, we want liberty, we want our kids educated, we want to be healthy. You remove that voice, you remove that from the political debate.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Spriggs. Dr. Hartman, would you like to respond?
Yes, so I agree with everything that William has said. I'll also offer maybe a couple other observations. As I can recall in a former life working for a company, very large global company, but was here in the US, historically started in the Midwest, northern Midwest, but was deliberately moving factories south because unions were not strong in that particular geography yet. Certainly were strong in the areas where this company had originated from. And so second thing I would say is with respect to Indiana, my observation, again, not someone who researches and studies social and economic policy like my colleagues, but I will say from somebody who has worked both in manufacturing settings as a machinist, as a designer, and also as a technical trainer and technology implementer, as well as now having spent a number of time here at Purdue as a faculty member and a researcher, I can say that one of the things I've observed as that happens here in Indiana a lot is Indiana ranks really high in a lot of the manufacturing metrics that are tracked as manufacturing metrics. Yet I think we have a gap here, and other states sort of have it here too, but or have it also. But I would say for Indiana, in some cases, we behave similarly to the way some of the low labor cost countries behave, in the sense that we'll give you cheap land, and here is a relatively speaking cheap labor force, and here's a bunch of tax breaks, and here is so on and so forth, if you set up your factory here in Indiana. And we tend to not have some of the more traditional sort of higher paying R&D or engineering or design jobs, proportionally speaking, right? Now, one of the things we're seeing around the world, though, is now certain countries are saying, no, we don't want to be just a production oriented country. We want you to put certain kinds of jobs here, or, you know, make certain kinds of your high value components here, which then requires, you know, a different kind of skill set, different kind of knowledge base, so on and so forth. And you know, at some point, the world's going to run out of low labor cost options, because people want to enjoy the fruits of their labor. They want to, you know, they want something better than, you know, low wages and poor working conditions and long hours and so on and so forth. And so at some point, you know, not just here in the US or not just in Indiana, but I would think globally, we're going to sort of reach this tipping point where, you know, that kind of phenomenon, or those ways of working are going to have to shift. And then the last point I would make is I have a project going right now with one of the rather large company in the auto industry, and part of our project was developing a model for them of what a factory of tomorrow looks like. And I have some partnerships with some colleagues over in the College of Education, where we're also looking at what does the workforce look like, what kinds of, you know, knowledge, skills, attitudes, dispositions, and so on does a workforce who's going to work in a technology or work in a factory with that kind of technology in place, what does that workforce need to know? How, and so some of what we're talking about, some of what they're asking us is, okay, we have this kind of a HR structure and job family and so on today. How does that need to look different in order to support, in order to maximize this kind of technology that we're planning to implement in our factory of tomorrow? And it's, you know, on one hand, been really refreshing to see that openness to conversation. But I can tell you, one of the things that we're having to navigate in these conversations is the fact that there is union representation on the teleconferences and so on with us, who is very interested, for obvious reasons, in what's happening with this. But I will also say that one of the things where I think unions could be very, very beneficial in this regard is unions have a long tradition of workforce training. Unions have a long tradition of the apprenticeship model and giving people credentials and status and pay, in fact, for increasing their knowledge, increasing their skill, increasing their level of expertise. And so, you know, at least, and again, coming from my maybe somewhat simplistic view of this, you know, I think it would behoove organizations that if they do have a unionized workforce, that they'd reach out and embrace the union folks from that workforce development perspective.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in really quickly, I totally agree. Nate, it's much like the conversation back in early 1980s, Lester Thoreau's zero-sum game about incentives that different states offer. You give up something when you do that, and sometimes it's not what you want long-term. And study after study proves that it's a zero-sum game, basically. So I wanted to mention that. But then also, here's something that I want to throw out there, an idea, and it answers maybe or addresses some of the elements of some of the different questions. Look at the model, going back to this idea of local and regional economies, look at the model of cooperatives, manufacturing cooperatives. And it really hasn't taken hold so much in the US, but it did in other countries. Spain and Italy are the two that probably have the most well-developed, and they've been over time. And these cooperatives are employee-owned, you know, member cooperatives, members own them, and they're vast and large, and they have very defined markets of the products they produce, and they're high skilled. Their wages are higher than other, you know, the surrounding area. They have their own educational systems, their own health care, child care. they are well developed and they are the strongest in their respective regions, and they're vast, they're large. I'm talking about tens and tens of thousands of employees, if not in hundreds of thousands. I'm not saying that we should necessarily move to that, but why couldn't we do something like that in areas that need improved well-being? Because what you're talking about, Nate, when you said, and Dr. Spriggs also, when you talked about what people want, you're talking about individual well-being. And we know what that is. That's our own personal things. But it's also community well-being for your family, for your neighbors, for the people you work with, for the people you see in your area, in your place, in your region, whatever that may be, a town, city, county, region, whatever, state. You know, that's what people want. And so how are ways to get that? And one way may be to look at these alternative structures that others have used very successfully. It's not union, but it's cooperative model, and have more, I guess, input into the outcomes that you get for those healthcare systems, for those educational systems, for the well-being of the members of that group that are producing these products for the global marketplace. And we probably all have some of those products in our house. If you have some of the ceramic tile, it probably came from one of those worker cooperatives. And so, you know, I think there's other things we can do. And then one other thing, and I know we're running out of time. If you want to play with those national comparisons, go see the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. Look at their Better Life Index. You can go through most of the countries in the world and play with the different inputs, whether that's workforce participation, childcare, healthcare, whatever it is, salary levels. It's a bit of a time suck, but it's okay because you learn from it. You know, it's a good one. You can compare the US against any other country. You can pick any country to compare against the others. And you will quickly see what Dr. Spriggs was talking about, how we have lost ground over time. And we've lost ground in those dimensions of what he's talking about, the care sector, care industry, but also the well-being. We've lost substantial ground there over time. And we're going to have to deal with it, with the policy, with structural changes. Everyone's going to have to come together from the private sector, public sector, and figure these things out, or we'll end up somewhere we don't want to be.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. And then I just wanted to check in with Dr. Kosich if you had any comments to kind of wrap up this discussion.
No, I think we went far reaching in many directions. I think, you know, I just enjoyed the panel. I thought it was a great panel, and I hope that look forward to your translation of it. And we each brought something new to the conversation. And now we need to figure out how to move forward on this. So just thank you very much and have a great day.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'll turn over to Dr. Connaughton for her concluding remarks. Dr.
Great.
Connaughton.
Ashima, Dr. Krishna, thank you so very much. And thanks to everyone. This has been such a rich discussion. And I agree completely, Ellen, that we must not lose momentum on this. And, you know, PPRI will certainly do our part by providing a summary report of what we've discussed here, but so many rich ideas for areas that are in desperate need of policy attention. Right. And so some, I think, really important opportunities to continue to do research that we hope will lead or help lead to some of that desperately needed attention. I want to thank each of our panelists so very much for your willingness to give your time today and your expertise. And also to everyone in attendance and participating today. Hope you all have a good week ahead. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay warm. Right. More soon. Thanks again.